So we got a disturbing trend that is chipping away at Americans' retirements that we wanted to talk with you a little bit about on this week's program, what it is and what you can maybe do to avoid or maybe manage it if it happens to be landing on your doorstep. And then here's a question for you. Did you inherit a retirement account over the course of the past few years? As the year 2025 draws to a close, know that there is action that you must take on that. IRS finally issued out some final rules on the distribution sequence for those retirement accounts inherited after 2020. So you might want to make sure that you are in compliance, because if you're not, then it's a 25% penalty of how much you should have taken out. Plus, you still owe taxes on all of that, assuming that it is a traditional retirement account. So all of that coming up on this week's episode of Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. One of Central Florida's longest running radio programs, also a top 25 financial planning podcast. So make sure you check us out on your favorite podcast channel. To find us, just search for Nelson Financial Planning with Joel Garris of Dollars and Cents. And hopefully you'll find the channel. If you have any trouble finding the channel, go to our website at Nelson Financial Planning. There you'll see a bunch of icons. Click on whichever one looks most familiar, and then you will get connected to our particular channel. Once you're there, make sure you subscribe so you don't have to do that again. And in fact, you wind up getting notified when we post new material, which, as you know, is at least weekly on any of our channels, including our YouTube channel as well. My name, of course, is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries as well. Their purpose, to help you make better decisions with your money. So make sure you check out our website at Nelson Financial Planning to learn a little bit more about us and how we might be able to help you. Our consultations are always free of charge. So a little bit more to discuss in terms of just this past week. Obviously, you had the Federal Reserve decision, which we're going to get into in detail in this opening segment, or maybe it flows into the second segment. We'll find that out as the show progresses. And ultimately, also had a busy week. Simon Conway, the host of Good Morning Orlando on this same radio program, invited me on to talk with him a little bit about beneficial ownership interest reporting under the Corporate Transparency Act. Look, folks, if you're a sort of a longtime listener of the program, you know that this has been kind of one of those on again, off again issues. And what it is there was a piece of legislation passed through Congress, as is typically the case when it comes to how a bill becomes a law. So back in January of 2021, the good folks in Congress, in a largely bipartisan vote, which is important to remember once we kind of get through describing what this is, the reality is that in that bipartisan vote, they passed this Corporate Transparency Act. The goal, of course, and as with any goal, it's met with good intentions, and the good intentions here was that by requiring businesses throughout America, and specifically small businesses, because if you're a large business, well, then chances are you're probably already publicly disclosing who the officers and the owners and things like that are. But this one was focused more on small businesses and really trying to sort of ferret out any type of illegal activity, such as money laundering, tax evasion, terrorist financing, any of that stuff, by sort of increasing the transparency around the ownership of business entities that were formed either here in the U.S. or foreign entities that are doing business here in the U.S. So the notion of trying to establish this transparency was to establish reporting requirements whereby businesses, whether it's corporations or LLCs or things like that. So think businesses, not necessarily like a sole proprietorship, but those that were registered to do business in the U.S. had to go through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network website, which is, of course, part of the U.S. Treasury, and do a filing or do a report that basically listed the individual owners of that company, or at least those that had at least a 25% stake in that business. So the information to report was a lot of personal identification information beyond just sort of names and addresses. You had to include birth dates, and then you also had to include a unique identification number. So whether that was your driver's license or your passport number or something like that. And then lastly, you then had to upload a picture of said document that you were using to provide that unique identification number. So as you might well imagine, there was a process to all of that. And then, of course, there was the ongoing obligation that anytime any of those things changes, like somebody's address changed or somebody got a new passport or whatever the case may be, you had an obligation as a business to go in and ultimately update when those changes were happening. And by the way, if you weren't in compliance, fines, even jail time on this stuff, because you had the reporting obligation and then you had the obligation to update anything and everything when it changed within a 30-day period of time. So that's kind of the background. There was a lot of court decisions, a lot of challenges to this, and effectively it was supposed to go into effect for the year 2025, and ultimately all of that kind of screeched to a halt. So the latest update is from sort of March of this year, where basically the U.S. Treasury Department said, hey, we're going to suspend the enforcement of the reporting requirement for U.S.-based companies. So we're going to basically change the definition or issue a final rule that basically narrows the scope or the definition of what a reporting company is to include only those foreign companies that are registered to do business here in the U.S. But I guess here's the thing, and this is why Simon Conway invited us on the program this past week, is to clarify, look, it's one thing to say we're going to suspend enforcement. It's one thing to say we're going to issue a rule that redefines what the definition of a reporting company is. All of that's all fine and good, and those are easy fixes. But until the actual bill is reversed in Congress, it's still the law of the land. So the issue is that if there's another difference of opinion on what a reporting company is, or if the suspension of enforcement is decided to not be suspended anymore, well, you get the drill. The reality is that it's still the law. So until it gets reversed by Congress, and this was what Simon and I discussed on Tuesday morning on his program, Good Morning Orlando, on the same station, until they reverse it, it's still the law. So for now, it's certainly a dead issue. You don't have to worry about these reporting obligations or anything like that, unless you're listening to this program and you own a foreign company that is doing business here in the U.S., then yeah, it still applies to you. But normal U.S.-based businesses doesn't apply anymore. The reporting requirement does not apply, but could it come back? I think that's the issue, is that, in fact, it could come back if, in fact, there's a different interpretation of what a foreign company or what the definition of a reporting company is. So one of those things where we don't necessarily know the future. For now, we don't have to worry about this beneficial ownership information reporting, or for that matter, having to keep it updated and all of those kinds of things. But, and that's a big but, it's still very much part of the legislation that was passed by Congress. And until Congress reverses it, then you might see this thing resurrect itself. For now, it appears dead, but you just don't know the future. Speaking of the future, the question on everybody's mind is the Fed going to keep cutting rates? Because they did this past week So what's the implications of that? And we're going to tackle that when we return here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So we're talking about trying to make sense out of the Fed's decision for cutting rates. And this is certainly a pretty big topic. Obviously, this past week, they cut rates. It was, in fact, their third cut. If you're keeping score, they cut in September, they cut in October, and they cut again here in December. Three cuts at a quarter point. Basically, the last three meetings, they have been cutting rates. So a total cumulative cut of 0.75% in the year 2025. So good news, bad news. Anytime you're talking about rate cuts, the good news is that the cost of borrowing money has gone down. If you're running a balance on your credit card, or if you're maybe trying to do a refinance or purchase a home, in theory, those borrowing costs all went down. The bad news is that if you have a bunch of money sitting in savings, well, then it's going to be earning even less money than what it was before. So that's certainly the good news, bad news. That always sort of plays out when the Fed cuts rates. The other piece of the equation is when we think about interest rates, and we think about what the Federal Reserve's role is in those interest rates, is that they're using interest rates like an accelerator or a brake when it comes to the economy. So when you cut rates, more often than not, you're kind of putting your foot on the accelerator, right? Because if you're lowering the cost of borrowing, maybe you're encouraging people to borrow more. And if people borrow more, then that's more money that sort of floods into the economy, right? Meanwhile, if you're raising rates, right, you're kind of tapping the brakes. And so ultimately you're saying, wait a minute, things might be getting a little bit too hot. Inflation might things like inflation, all of that, all of those things wind up coming into that mix. So if you're kind of tapping the brakes a little bit, then you're looking to kind of say, hey, we got to slow some things down economically. And ultimately, that's kind of how the increase and the decrease of rates work. So this past week, Federal Reserve did an interest rate cut. Here's the interesting thing behind it, and I think this is the thing that really kind of warrants a little bit more of a discussion. And help to bring perspective, because there's a lot of conversation about the Fed. There's a lot of conversation about the Fed chair, Jerome Powell. His term ends in May. The Trump administration had obviously been very open about, hey, he is not invited back for another term. We're going to put somebody else in place. And with the notion of that the person that they're going to put in place is going to ultimately push rates lower. We like lower rates because that, reduces down the cost of borrowing, and in theory is a positive accelerant to economic activity and economic growth. But here's the thing, okay? When we think about what went on just this past week, it was not a unanimous decision by the Fed to cut rates. In fact, there were 3 dissents to the decision to cut rates. 2 opposed any cut. 1 wanted a larger cut. But more interestingly, 4 additional Fed officials signaled disagreement with what the overall board was doing by projecting a higher interest rate for 2025 than the committee, in fact, improved. In his news conference after they met, Powell emphasized a couple of different things. First of all, cutting rates is getting harder than it looks, given economic uncertainties. And I guess that's the other piece of the equation when we think about what the Fed's doing. If the Fed is sort of putting the foot on the gas, cutting rates, then that by its very nature suggests, at least from an economic perspective, hey, wait a minute, things aren't maybe as good as they should be. And certainly Powell's pointing to the labor data. And in fact, during the news conference, he suggested that there's probably 60,000 less jobs that are in the data that aren't getting reported, meaning that the labor data may in fact be overstated by about 60,000 jobs per month. I guess the reality is when businesses close and lay off people, they don't bother to, go through the process of filing the report with the Department of Labor. Understand, because the Labor Department statistics are based upon surveys of businesses. So yes, you're supposed to complete and send in the survey in a timely manner, but what happens is people don't, and people are less likely to turn in these surveys. In fact, it used to be that there was about 90% plus compliance on these labor surveys. Now it's like 70%, maybe even a little bit under 70%. So you get why it's hard to get good data these days on the labor market, tossing the fact that, the government was shut down for a couple months there, and, you get the idea. But here's the perspective, and I think here's the thing to remember. Yes, Jerome Powell is the face of the Federal Reserve as the chairman, and he's the guy that does the press conference after they meet, all of that good stuff. But there's 19 people on that Federal Open Market Committee, of which 12 are voting members. So in order to get a rate cut, you're going to need at least the majority of those voting members to agree to said rate cut. And the reality is that all 19 participate and give their view, give their opinion, and 4 of the 12 sort of voting members actually rotate every single year because they're bank presidents, certain reserve chair, those kinds of sort of officials. So the board itself, or at least the voting part, doesn't stay stagnant. And the split in terms of perspective on what's going on with interest rates is in fact growing. So for this December meeting, well, let me back up a little bit. For the December meetings in 2021, 2022, 2023, there was absolutely no recorded dissent among Fed officials on where year-end rates should have been set. None. Dissent started creeping in last December when in December of 2024, there were actually 4 different officials who sort of disagreed with where those year-end rates should have been set. And then this year, it went from 4 up to 7. So 7 out of 19 disagree with what's going on. That suggests that whatever happens with rates, it's going to be a little bit trickier to shift those rates as a result of kind of this perception that it's not just one person. It's in fact 12 voting members, all of which have different opinions. There's 19 members on the actual committee, and then 4 of the 12 that are voting, they rotate annually. So it's really hard to kind of, I guess, stack the deck, if you will, because it's changing every year. So a lot of challenges in terms of thinking ahead and whether the Fed's going to continue to cut rates. Obviously, they're starting to show some divisions within the Fed as to who thinks rates should be cut versus not cut. And the reality is that the Federal Reserve has always sort of operated on sort of a consensus-driven structure that really does make it kind of difficult to push through more aggressive rate cuts, and particularly when you think about what's going on economically. Obviously, consumer spending appears to be hanging in there pretty well, but the labor market certainly is showing those signs of slowing. So it's interesting as we kind of see the headlines and see all this conversation. But, just a replacement of Jerome Powell as the Fed chair is not going to necessarily move the needle that dramatically, because there's like 11 other people that vote and a total of 18 other people who have the ability to express opinions on what's going on within the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee. So the reality is that I suppose without sort of a major economic weakness, significant rate cuts as we look ahead to 2026 probably aren't in the cards at this point. The reality is that if you do have a lot of rate cuts, it could mean that things aren't as good in the economy, so that's certainly not good. And if you cut rates and there's not an economic reason to do that, then you run the risk of creating bubbles and inflating asset prices, which that doesn't end well either. So just wanted to share with you our perspective on kind of that whole conversation, that whole headline that we hear about in terms of the Federal Reserve particularly the fact that the Federal Reserve met this past week and decided to cut rates. But the question is, what does the future hold? And I think the future is much more murkier than we might think it is. With that, we're going to get on, we're going to take a break here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. Did you inherit a retirement account over the course of the past few years? Particularly since 2020, as you know, or if you're a regular listener to the program, of course you know this, but if you're not, welcome to the program. Glad you joined us. If you inherited a retirement account post-2020, you've got a whole nother different set of rules. And the reality is that given that the air date for this program is December 14th of 2025, you have a very limited window between now and the end of the year where you might need to act on that thing and take some money out if you have not done so in order to stay compliant. So here's the issue, I guess, on this is that, you know, the rules were changed in 2020. If you inherit a retirement account after January 1st of 2020, then you have 10 years in which you must take all of the money out and ultimately pay taxes on those dollars. If it is a regular retirement account, if it's a Roth then that you inherited, well, then you don't have to pay the taxes, but you still got to take all of the money out. Bottom line is that the folks in Washington don't want all this money just sitting there and not having paid any taxes on it, or in the case of the Roth, continuing to grow on a tax-free basis. So in essence, they have this mechanism where they force you to take the money out. Prior to 2020, you could use basically the rest of your life in which to take that money out. But after 2020, you've got to take it all within that 10-year period of time. So here's where the confusing part comes in, and this is why 2025 and making sure that you are compliant in this year, 2025, is important. And so what happened is, the IRS was not very clear, and well, the original legislation passed by Congress wasn't very clear. Big shock there, right? But because it wasn't clear, then the IRS needed to issue out some rules and some parameters as to how to deal with these inherited retirement accounts. But, you know, they didn't. This whole global pandemic thing, all that good stuff happened. And so they were slow to issue out the rules. And it took them until last year to issue out final rules. And they said, hey, okay, here are the final rules, and they're going to apply for the year 2025. And so the big difference is that if the person that you inherited the retirement account from was taking required minimum distributions, then you must continue to take required minimum distributions on that same schedule that they were on, which thereby forces you to take a certain amount of money out of that account. If you didn't do it, no big deal prior to this year, 2025. But if you've been ignoring it and haven't taken anything out, you need to for this year, 2025, because what was happening is because the IRS was taking such a long time to issue out these rules to make these determinations, they said, okay, fine, we're just going to, we're going to suspend any type of enforcement on whether you took money out or whether you didn't or anything like that. We're going to let it go, okay? But starting in 2025, 5 years after the bill passed, but who's counting? The reality is we now have rules that you must comply with, and chief among them is that if the person that you inherited from was taking a required distribution, then you have to continue that same schedule. Now, once you inherit a retirement account beyond that required minimum distribution, then there's flexibility as to how you take out the remaining balance of that account. Maybe you divide it up equally between the remaining amount of years, or maybe there's something that happens. Maybe you sell an investment property or get a large bonus at work or whatever the case may be. Maybe then in that year you don't take anything out extra, but if you've got this required minimum distribution amount, then you still have to do that. The key point on all of this stuff is that you can no longer ignore the deadlines. That time has sort of passed, and there are specific rules that are now fully in effect to take out that required minimum distribution. Understand that when you take the money out, it's going to be taxable unless it is a Roth. If you inherited a Roth, then the tax-free nature of that continues. You still have to follow the distribution, the 10-year distribution window. But if you inherited a retirement account that was pre-tax money, then you have to pay the taxes on that. The kicker on that is that you don't have to worry about any withdrawal penalty or anything like that might traditionally apply to a regular retirement account that is in your name. So for that, if you're under 59 and a half, then you would have a 10% penalty on a regular retirement account that would be sort of your retirement account. But when you inherit a retirement account, it doesn't matter how old you are, when you take that money out, yes, you still have to pay the taxes on it, but you do not need to worry about any penalty for early distribution. So a key distinction there. And then another part of the takeaway is just thinking about what does that rolling 10-year period look like, or maybe you're in, year 5 of 10 and you've only got 5 more years to go, or maybe you got 8 more years to go, wherever you are in that window, because the clock starts once that person passes away. Then the clock starts on sort of that 10-year distribution window. So you really need to kind of look at that decade and think about, okay, how best to plan for these distributions that are going to be happening over the course of time, because ultimately you want to make sure that you're coordinating that with your overall financial and income picture, right? So you don't want to have to take out extra money when you're being forced to report a gain on an investment property or having a big distribution from an employer perspective. So just know that there's a little bit more to planning and scheduling and working through all of this. And the notion of trying to integrate it with your other retirement accounts and the rest of your financial picture makes a lot of sense. In this case, oftentimes when people come into the office and they have this issue, we really kind of plot out, basically using an Excel spreadsheet, because that's a pretty effective way to do it. You almost wind up plotting out each of those 10 years to determine, okay, what's the timing of when I want to tackle all of this and have this additional income on my tax return. So bottom line on this, if you inherit a retirement account, that's great. But there's a few key things to remember. First of all, know that there's deadlines on this thing, right? There's the 10-year rule that you must observe. And then there's also this rule that is now fully enforceable, that if the person that you inherited the account from was taking required distributions, then you have to maintain that same distribution schedule. So know the deadlines, if you will, on all of this, because if you don't take the right amount, then there's a 25% penalty on that amount that you should have taken. So pretty significant cost. Number 2, sort of understand the particular account type, right? If it's a Roth account that you inherited, well, that's great. 10-year rule still applies, but you don't have to worry about these required minimum distributions, and you don't obviously have to worry about paying the taxes on those distributions. If it's a regular pre-tax retirement account, then yes, you got to worry about the required minimum distributions, and yes, you got to worry about taxes, but you do not have to worry about any early withdrawal penalty or anything like that, because all of that is waived when someone inherits a retirement account. Number 3, make sure you've got a strategy in terms of the withdrawal. As you might well imagine, this is certainly something to kind of really balance out and to try and really kind of schedule it out to try and minimize and do this as tax efficiently as possible. Certainly for something like that, we would encourage you to consult a professional. As I said, we do this analysis all the time in the office at Nelson Financial Planning. And really it's about kind of really sketching out that 10-year window to get a pretty good handle on what that can be. Certainly inherited retirement accounts are pretty cool to inherit because, hey, what's wrong with that? But you got to make sure you're playing by the rules on them. So with that, we'll take a break here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So let's shift gears and talk about something that we were kind of talking a little bit about at the beginning of the program, and that's this disturbing trend that really is impacting Americans' retirement. The reality is, of course, the source of this trend may very well be right in front of you, because it could be, if you're sitting at your table listening to this program or looking at the podcast, it could be a family member sitting across from you at that table, because that's part of this trend that we're seeing more and more, where retirement savings are getting drained for millions of Americans as a result of the financial support that they are having to make on behalf of family members. And when we think about family members, think about not just the kids or maybe even the grandkids, but also the parents as well. The reality is that this is the situation that is very much a reality for millions of Americans in terms of providing financial support to those family members. And unfortunately, and I guess fortunately for the recipients, I suppose, but unfortunately, providing that financial support often cuts into the retirement savings that people have. And ultimately, certainly, you've got a lot of emotions when it comes to family, and you certainly want to help them and support them and be generous, but the issue is almost more of a systemic issue, whereby folks sort of underestimate how much and how hard it is to just sort of stop this spending habit. And of course, the result of all this, as you might well imagine then, is that people are entering retirement with less money or stress and kind of fewer options, if you will. So certainly not a good combination. And the stats on this one are pretty dramatic. We'll just read you a few of them. The reality is that in 2023, 45% of Americans ages 18 to 29 live with their parents. That's the highest percentage since the 1940s. Many Americans, according to surveys that are done on this topic, many Americans would rather sacrifice their own comfort than stop helping family. 58%, in fact, so that's the majority, are willing to live below their accustomed standard to help family members. 54% are willing to return to work part-time. Only 15% are, in fact, willing to reduce or stop financial support to family. So all of that just adds to the retirement crisis that is in America today, where people simply have not saved enough for retirement. This is sort of one of those silent drags, or maybe not quite so silent, seeing how it's a family member, that continues to sort of eat away on Americans and their ability to retire. And it continues to be a growing problem. Obviously, we shared that statistic of the number of kids age 18 to 29 that are living with their parents, almost half, if you will, 45%, significantly higher than any other time that we've seen in many, many decades. It's also a growing problem in terms of the amount, in terms of the dollar amount, because of inflation and things like that. It just continues to increase the dollar. So here are the numbers. The parents who continue to support adult children, even after they've graduated, spend an average of about $1,500 per month per child, roughly 6% more than last year. That doesn't even take into account those that we have certainly worked with in the office that are taking a significant chunk and putting it towards the cost of care for mom and dad. I mean, those can be several $1,000s every single month that's going towards that cost of care. And so this is really an issue that is sort of up and down the generations, if you will. According to the numbers, 17% support adult children, meaning over the age of 26. 10% of families are supporting grandchildren. and then 7% are supporting parents or in-laws. So no question that that's got a negative impact on society, especially when at the end of the day, only about 15% said that they would cut the family support. So obviously that puts you in a tough spot, right? I mean, those are some pretty significant issues. So in this closing segment, we wanted to chat with you a little bit about some of the things that you can do. And look, maybe this is, you've certainly heard me talk a little bit more on episodes this year here in 2025 about this particular topic. It's one that sort of is near and dear to my heart because I find myself being the sole caregiver of my mother. So that comes with a whole host of issues and things that we will not get into great detail here on the program. But needless to say, she is struggling with Alzheimer's. So this is probably more on my heart than it has been in years past. And then, okay, because this is like we're like the sandwich generation. If you're kind of similar age as me, and we won't disclose that, but you can look at the video and kind of guess. And my oldest son moved back home. At least the good news is that he has a job, so that's good. But yeah, that clearly, if you're in that sort of Generation X and others, sort of getting squeezed between aging parents and adult children. So this is why perhaps this issue, weighs on me, and we want to talk about it. We want to share with you kind of some of the strategies to implement if you find yourself in this situation to help reduce stress and to have it have less of an impact on your retirement. So it really comes down to, folks, kind of figuring out what those numbers are, figuring what those boundaries are, kind of setting some guidelines, having some difficult conversations as to what you can afford, what you can't afford. Ultimately, as we talk about all the time on the program, it sort of comes back to your budget and what those numbers are and how you are projecting in terms of your own personal retirement. So this is one of the things, obviously, that we do all the time at Nelson Financial Planning is we help to look at all those numbers, and we help to look and see, okay, yes, you're on track for retirement. No, you're not. And ultimately help you through that process of trying to figure out how to create some boundaries or how to set some guidelines in terms of kind of how that money is getting spent. Because the most important thing is that the impact on your own personal retirement might be quite significant because those payments are not getting less. In fact, as these statistics show, they are getting more. So it's important to really kind of look at what those numbers are in terms of your income, in terms of your own expense, and in terms of how much you ultimately need to save for retirement. And then from there, sort of figuring out, okay, how much extra do we have that we could support a child or a grandchild or an adult child or an adult grandchild, or how much could we contribute towards the medical expenses of those parents or in-laws. And unfortunately, we see this issue all the time with folks that are struggling sort of with both sides of the equation. So we just wanted to sort of give you some words of encouragement here as we sort of get into the full face of the holiday season over the course of the next couple of weeks here, and know that the most important thing that you can do is really to kind of sit down and work through these numbers. They're not going to all of a sudden just magically improve on their own. It really takes an in-depth analysis in order to kind of figure out what that ultimately looks like. Because at the end of the day, family support is certainly important, and we're not saying it's not, but your financial future matters too. And the sooner you recognize the trade-offs and the sooner you're better prepared to really understand what the numbers are, the better off you will be. That's one of the biggest reasons why we wrote, why we do this podcast on a weekly basis, is to help you gain perspective. Also why we wrote our book and our workbook, our companion workbook, Next Gen Dollars and Cents. As you know, this holiday season, those resources are available to you absolutely free. All you need to do is go to our website at nelsonfinancialplanning.com, and there you can request your free copy, or you can call the office at 406 629-6477 and request your free copy that way as well. So with that, we're going to wrap it on up and get on out of here. Thank you all for listening to this week's edition of Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning.